He was born beneath the shadow of pyramids, in a kingdom that bowed to men who called themselves gods. Power had a scent in Egypt, spices, bronze, and fear, and Moses breathed it long before he knew the name of Yahweh. He grew up surrounded by walls carved with conquests and names meant to outlive their owners. Yet in that vast empire, humility would take root in the most unexpected heart. The Nile had carried him from danger into privilege. While Hebrew infants vanished in the river's current, he floated toward survival wrapped in reeds and divine irony. The daughter of Pharaoh found him, and from that moment the boy of the oppressed became the prince of the oppressors. Every garment he wore, every word he spoke, was stitched with contradiction. But power, when it whispers long enough, begins to sound like destiny. Egypt trained him to command, to measure worth by rank, and to believe that silence meant submission. Yet sometimes, the closer a man stands to a throne, the further he drifts from his soul. Moses watched injustice dressed as law, cruelty disguised as order, and wondered if heaven could hear the cries buried beneath the marble floors. Then came the moment that would fracture his illusion, a single act of violence that revealed the war inside him. The prince struck down the Egyptian who beat a Hebrew slave. One heartbeat of rage, one instant of awakening, and everything he thought he was collapsed in dust. Power had trained his hands, but conscience claimed his heart. In that collision of privilege and truth, the story begins, not of Egypt's power, but of its undoing inside one man's spirit. Sometimes humility is not learned through sermons, but through exile. Sometimes the path away from the throne is the first step toward freedom. There are moments when the walls we build for safety become prisons for the soul, and when the silence around us asks the same question that once haunted a prince. When did comfort begin to replace calling? He grew among polished pillars and painted ceilings, but the songs that reached him in dreams were not Egyptian. Somewhere deep inside, the rhythm of his heartbeat still carried the echo of the Hebrew lullabies his mother once whispered before she was forced to let him go. The palace gave him everything a man could want except peace. Every lesson taught him mastery, every tutor praised his potential, yet none could explain why his spirit trembled each time he looked at the laborers bent beneath the sun. He was trained to rule them, but something within him refused to forget he was one of them. Egypt had its gods, carved in stone and guarded by gold, yet none of them spoke to his restlessness. He began to understand that silence itself could be a teacher. As he walked through the halls where power shimmered like mirages, he realized that even marble walls can echo with emptiness. The royal tutors told him the world was built on order, that every man had his place, that Pharaoh's word was divine. But when he looked at the faces of slaves, he saw a truth that the palace dared not teach. Sometimes injustice wears the mask of stability. He wondered if the God of his forgotten people still saw them. He wondered if that same God saw him. And in that wondering, humility began to take its first breath. Power had surrounded him, polished him, prepared him for greatness, yet what he craved most was meaning. It is strange how we can stand in abundance and still feel the ache of absence. That ache would one day become the seed of his calling, but for now it simply lingered, quiet, heavy, holy. The palace was more than stone and gold. It was a classroom where pride was the curriculum. Every corridor reminded Moses that status was a currency, and worth depended on how many bowed when he passed. He was surrounded by men who mistook fear for respect, and he began to sense how easily the two could blend. Egypt had built perfection out of hierarchy. Servants bowed to princes, princes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh to no one. Power flowed downward like the Nile, flooding everything it touched, leaving behind the fertile illusion that control meant purpose. Yet even in luxury, Moses felt the cracks beneath the surface. He saw laughter without joy, rituals without meaning, and leaders who commanded the world but couldn't govern their hearts. He learned that the more a man is worshipped, the less he remembers how to listen. There is a moment when admiration turns to isolation, when the noise of applause drowns the voice within. In that quiet erosion, Moses discovered the danger of becoming untouchable. The palace was teaching him how to rule, but God was teaching him how to see. He watched Pharaoh speak with the certainty of a god and wondered if pride had a sound, a tone so loud it silences conscience. One evening, while torches flickered across the temple walls, he realized that power can polish a man's image even as it corrodes his soul. And though he didn't yet know it, humility was already calling his name through the cracks of his privilege, waiting for the moment pride would finally break. One morning, the sun rose like fire over the city, and Moses walked among the laborers. The air smelled of dust and sweat, of stones dragged across the earth to raise monuments that would never bear their builders' names. He had seen the work before, but never from so close. The shouts of overseers cut through the rhythm of hammers, and in that harsh music he heard something sacred break. A man fell beneath the whip, his cry swallowed by the crowd's fear, and for the first time Moses looked, not with royal eyes, but with the eyes of the slave. The weight of another man's pain entered him. It was not pity, it was recognition. The faces around him blurred, but the truth sharpened. He belonged to both worlds, and yet to neither. He was a prince by adoption and a brother by blood. The contradiction tore at him like chains. That day, Egypt became smaller. The palace, once vast, now seemed built on suffering too wide to ignore. Moses returned to his chambers, but the cries of the workers followed him into the silence. He tried to pray to Egypt's gods, but their stone faces offered no comfort. That night, he lay awake and understood that indifference is a kind of violence. Sometimes, the only difference between the ruler and the oppressor is who dares to look away. We often think humility is weakness, yet in truth, it begins when we finally choose to see. The next day, he returned, drawn not by duty but by unrest. The memory of the whip still rang in his chest, a sound that would not fade. He walked unnoticed among the workers, his royal robes brushing against the dust of their labor. Then he saw it again, an overseer striking a Hebrew until the man could no longer stand. Something within Moses ignited, not from anger alone, but from the unbearable dissonance between who he was and what he saw. For a moment the palace vanished, the blood in his veins louder than the law of Pharaoh. His hand rose before his mind could reason, and the Egyptian fell lifeless in the sand. Silence followed, deep and terrible. The sun burned above as if to witness the fracture of a soul. Moses looked at the body, at the blood sinking into the earth, and felt the weight of both justice and guilt press upon him. The act that freed another had now enslaved him to consequence. He buried the body, but not the echo of his choice. That night he could not sleep. He realized that when power is used without wisdom, even good intentions can become chains. He saw his reflection in the polished bronze of the palace and barely recognized the man staring back. Sometimes, the moment we rise to defend truth is also the moment God begins to dismantle our pride. The next morning, he woke with the quiet knowing that his life in Egypt had ended, even if his feet had not yet left its ground. He fled before dawn, the horizon still gray, carrying nothing but fear and the echo of footsteps behind him. The desert opened like a mouth, vast and merciless, and each step away from Egypt felt like walking into judgment. He had traded palaces for silence, gold for dust, certainty for exile. The heat stripped away his pride faster than time could heal his shame. Days turned to nights without measure, and solitude became his only companion. The man who once commanded servants now spoke to the wind, learning that humility begins when there is no one left to impress. Hunger softened him. Thirst quieted him. The absence of voices became the first space where he could finally hear his own. In Egypt, he had learned to lead through power. In the wilderness, he began to learn to lead through surrender. There is a strange mercy in being emptied, a grace in being forgotten. When a man loses everything that defined him, what remains is the truth God can finally use. Moses found shelter in Midian, but even safety could not erase the weight of his past. He watched the stars and wondered if God still remembered him, or if exile was the price of awakening. Sometimes divine preparation feels like punishment. Sometimes being hidden is the only way heaven can rebuild what pride destroyed. And though he did not yet know it, the desert that humbled him would one day become the place where a nation met their God. Years passed like wind over the dunes. The desert, once foreign, became familiar, and the man who had fled Egypt no longer looked like a prince. The lines on his face spoke of sun and time, not throne and power. He tended sheep now, guiding them through the same emptiness that once frightened him. Yet in that quiet, something sacred was forming. The silence was not absence, it was instruction. The sand had its own language, spoken in patience and stillness. Each day repeated itself, but repetition became revelation. Moses began to notice that even silence moves in rhythm with purpose. The wind shifts, the stars change, and the heart, if humble enough, begins to listen. He had once commanded men, now he followed animals, and in that reversal, God was teaching him how to lead without needing to be seen. The world forgot him, but heaven had not. The same God who once allowed the Nile to cradle him now allowed the wilderness to refine him. When prayers seemed unanswered, they were being rewritten into understanding. The voice of God does not always thunder. Sometimes it hides in the rustle of sand between tired feet. It is there that Moses learned that the truest strength is not the roar of command, but the stillness that waits for divine timing. Perhaps the greatest proof of faith is to keep walking even when heaven stays silent. One morning, the familiar landscape changed. The desert was the same, yet something shimmered where everything should have been still. A bush burned without being consumed, a flame alive with purpose rather than destruction. Moses stopped, drawn by wonder more than fear. For years he had spoken to silence, and now silence spoke back through fire. The voice that came from within the blaze was not like any he had heard in Egypt. It did not demand, it invited. "Take off your sandals," it said, "for the ground you stand on is holy." In that command, everything reversed. The man who once stood before Pharaoh now trembled before a flame. The God he had doubted revealed himself not with thunder, but with presence. The desert that had emptied him now overflowed with meaning. Moses hid his face, ashamed to be seen by holiness, yet unable to look away. God called his name twice, as if to awaken both the prince he was and the shepherd he had become. And there, between ashes and light, he received the impossible mission to return to the land he had fled, to speak to the throne that had once defined him. Humility met destiny, and destiny wore no crown. Sometimes God waits until the fire inside us burns out, so he can ignite one that never dies. The bush burned for Moses that day, but it still burns for anyone who has ever mistaken failure for the end of their story. He stood before the flame but could not lift his eyes for long. The command was clear, yet his heart resisted. He had failed once in Egypt. How could he return as anything but a shadow of that failure? "Who am I," he asked, "that I should go to Pharaoh?" It was not disbelief in God, it was disbelief in himself. The years in the desert had buried his pride, but along with it his confidence. God did not argue. He simply said, "I will be with you." Those words were not a strategy, they were the cure. Still, Moses protested. His tongue felt heavy, his courage thin. He tried to excuse himself with weakness, but heaven does not choose strength. It builds it through surrender. Each objection he raised was met with patience. The one who had shaped worlds was now shaping a man through mercy. Brokenness had made him reluctant, but it also made him usable. Pride acts quickly, humility hesitates. Yet God prefers the hesitant, for they move only when he moves. In the glow of the burning bush, Moses learned that calling is not proof of ability, but of trust. The desert had done its work. It had turned a prince into a servant, a speaker of commands into a listener of whispers. He finally bowed, not before Pharaoh, but before purpose. And from that kneeling place, history began to shift. When a heart yields, even the smallest yes can shake empires. He descended the mountain carrying no crown, no army, no plan, only a staff and a promise. Each step toward Egypt was a return to the place of his shame, yet also to the birthplace of his mission. The path back felt longer than the years he had spent away. With every mile, memories rose like ghosts, the palace, the murder, the flight. But now the fear that once chased him had become a shadow that walked behind him, not before him. God had not changed Pharaoh's palace. He had changed the man sent to stand before it. When Moses saw the city's outline against the horizon, it no longer gleamed with power. It looked fragile, temporary, smaller than he remembered. Egypt was vast, but God was vaster. Aaron met him on the road, and together they spoke of what lay ahead, the message that would shake a kingdom built on centuries of control. Moses' voice still trembled, yet each word carried weight, not his own. The staff in his hand, once a shepherd's tool, would soon split seas and topple thrones. What once symbolized survival would now represent surrender. True authority, he was learning, flows not from who holds it, but from whose will sustains it. He entered Egypt quietly, the same way he had left, but this time the silence was not fear. It was faith walking softly into the storm. The throne room smelled of incense and iron. Pharaoh sat high above, draped in symbols of eternity, the living embodiment of Egypt's pride. Moses entered without bowing. The air thickened with disbelief. The boy who had once dined at that table now stood as the messenger of a god the empire did not know. "Let my people go," he said, and the words fell like a hammer against marble. Pharaoh's laughter filled the room, sharp and hollow. "Who is this god," he asked, "that I should obey his voice?" For a moment, Moses felt the echo of his old fear, but he spoke again, steadier this time. Every word carried the weight of wilderness and the patience of fire. The staff touched the ground and became a serpent, a sign of authority, not born of magic, but of surrender. Yet the magicians imitated it, and Pharaoh's heart hardened. It was not just a battle between men, it was a collision between pride and purpose. Power met humility, and pride mocked it, unaware that humility never loses, it waits. As plague after plague descended, Moses stood not as a prince commanding vengeance, but as a servant announcing consequence. Each time Pharaoh's defiance grew, so did Moses' peace. He no longer fought for validation, he simply delivered truth. And that is the moment when true strength becomes unshakable, when obedience matters more than outcome. Each new dawn brought warning, and each warning met the same wall of arrogance. Pharaoh's heart, once merely proud, now calcified into defiance. Egypt trembled under locusts, darkness, and death, yet the throne clung to its illusion of control. Moses no longer pleaded, he proclaimed. The voice that once shook in fear now spoke with calm conviction. He had learned that the power of a message does not depend on the listener's response. Each plague was not only judgment, it was mercy delayed, another chance for Pharaoh to see what he refused to see. But pride is blindness with a crown. Even as the waters turned to blood, the ruler of the Nile denied the hand behind it. Moses watched and grieved, not as an enemy, but as a man who once stood in the same darkness. He understood now that hardness of heart is not born overnight. It grows from years of believing we are the center. Egypt was collapsing under the weight of its gods, and in that collapse, Moses saw a reflection of what power without humility becomes. The miracles that terrified Pharaoh humbled Moses. Every display of divine strength reminded him that he was only a vessel, a voice carried by obedience. When the night of the final plague came, he walked through the silence knowing that freedom would cost pain and that even liberation leaves scars. The night of escape came wrapped in wind and trembling. Behind them, the cries of Egypt echoed. Before them stretched the impossible sea. Moses stood between terror and promise, a shepherd once again, but now his flock was a nation. The people cried out, fear louder than faith, demanding why freedom looked like death. He turned toward the waves, feeling the same uncertainty they felt, and for a moment the desert's silence returned. Then the voice came again, not in fire, but in command. Lift your staff. The same wood that once led sheep now pointed toward deliverance. The sea obeyed what men could not. Walls of water rose, trembling with divine breath, and the ground beneath became dry. They crossed, each step echoing the lesson of a lifetime. Power belongs to God alone. Behind them, Pharaoh's chariots thundered, symbols of strength chasing what they could no longer control. When the waters closed, pride drowned and silence returned, different this time, sacred. Moses did not cheer. He stood still, watching the sea calm, aware that victory without humility easily becomes vengeance. The people sang, but he listened. Freedom, he knew, was not an end, but a test. To lead hearts freed by miracles yet bound by fear would require more patience than confronting Pharaoh ever did. Sometimes the greatest storm is not the one we cross, but the one we carry. Years later, the desert stretched before them again, but this time Moses walked not as a fugitive nor as a prince, but as a man who had learned that authority means service. The people still complained, still doubted, still looked backward toward chains that once held them. Yet Moses no longer sought to prove himself, he sought only to obey. The palace had taught him to command, the wilderness taught him to kneel. When he raised his staff now, it was not to display power, but to channel trust. Every miracle reminded him that he was dust carried by purpose. Even when frustration burned, when he struck the rock in anger instead of speaking to it, he felt the sting of consequence and understood that leadership without humility is just another form of bondage. The one who had faced kings was still learning to master his own heart. He aged in the desert, but wisdom grew younger within him, softening what pride once hardened. His name became a whisper of endurance, his life a lesson that greatness is not in conquest, but in surrender. The man who once fled Egypt now fled from glory, content to let God be seen instead. Perhaps that is how humility leaves its mark, not in statues or stories, but in the quiet conviction that some victories are meant to stay unseen. He climbed one last mountain, the same posture as always, alone before God, unarmed before eternity. From its peak, he saw the land he had long pursued, yet would never enter. The wind carried no promises now, only peace. He had spent a lifetime learning that obedience is not about arrival, but about remaining faithful along the way. Egypt was behind him, the wilderness within him, and heaven ahead. Looking back, he could trace the shape of his story. Power stripped, pride broken, humility born. The boy drawn from the Nile had become the man who led others through it. What Egypt had taught him about strength, God had rewritten through surrender. He died with no crown, no monument, no throne, only the presence that had once spoken from fire and never stopped walking beside him. Perhaps that is the quiet end of every servant who lives for something greater than themselves, to vanish so that glory remains. And across generations, his legacy endures, not because he ruled, but because he bowed. In every era, the question returns like a whisper through time. When power corrupts, will humility still have a voice? Maybe that is where faith begins, not in the palace nor in the sea, but in the heart that chooses gentleness when pride would be easier,